My name is Margaret Thompson. I am 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and a widow of nearly 10 years. Once my days were filled with the laughter of children, the satisfaction of seeing them learn, and the warmth of a home that was entirely my own. These days, my life is quieter, too quiet at times, and my home is no longer mine. I live in the basement of my son's house. The basement is not what most people might imagine. It's clean with neatly painted walls, a small rug under the bed, and a compact kitchenette tucked into one corner. There's a small window near the ceiling that lets in thin strips of light during the day. It's comfortable enough, but it has the unmistakable feeling of being separate. Down here, the air feels different. The sounds of life upstairs are muffled. I hear footsteps, conversations, laughter, but it's all from above where I don't usually go. I moved here about 2 years ago. David, my son, had suggested it when I sold my own house. It was an old home, the one my late husband and I had built our lives in. Maintaining it became too much for me alone, and David said it would be easier for everyone if I stayed with him and his family. His wife, Karen, welcomed the idea at the time, smiling warmly and saying there was plenty of space for me. She showed me the basement and said it was private, and just for me. At first, I told myself this was temporary. I'd stay for a while, help with my granddaughter, Emily, maybe even look for a small apartment later. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. The basement became my space, and I found myself moving through the house like a careful guest. Every morning, I wake up early. I make tea and quietly prepare breakfast for myself. Sometimes I'll make pancakes or oatmeal for Emily, leaving them on the counter upstairs before they wake up. Most mornings, Karen takes Emily to school while David rushes off to work. I tidy up after they've left, run a load of laundry, and water the plants in the yard. I keep myself busy, cleaning, cooking, organizing small corners of the house, but always mindful not to be in the way. Emily is 8 years old, bright and full of energy. She has my late husband's eyes and my smile, though she doesn't know it. She often comes down to the basement to sit with me, coloring or talking about her day. She doesn't seem to notice that I'm not upstairs like everyone else. Or maybe she does, but she's a child. She accepts things as they are. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, Emily sat on the edge of my bed, swinging her legs. She looked at me with her big, curious eyes and asked, "Grandma, why do you sleep in the basement?" Her question caught me off guard. For a moment, I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at her sweet, innocent face and forced a smile. "Well, sweetheart, the basement is nice and quiet. It's just my place." She tilted her head as if trying to decide whether that made sense. "But it's dark down here, and cold sometimes." I smoothed the blanket on my bed, avoiding her eyes. "I like it," I lied softly. "Besides, I can hear you playing from here. It's not so far." Emily seemed satisfied enough with my answer, though I could tell she still didn't quite understand. When she left to go upstairs, I sat on the bed for a long moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade. Her question lingered in the room, echoing in my mind. In truth, I hadn't thought much about it in a long time. It was easier not to. The basement had simply become normal. But Emily's words stirred something in me, like an old wound I thought had healed but hadn't. Dinner times are always a reminder of my place here. Most evenings I have my meals downstairs. Sometimes Karen will bring me a plate after the family eats. Other times, I make something for myself. On rare occasions, I join them at the dining table, but it's usually at Karen's invitation. "It's more comfortable for you this way?" she often says with a polite smile. David doesn't say much about it. He's busy, always working, always distracted. He hugs me when he comes home, but rarely sits to talk. I can't blame him entirely. Life is hectic, and maybe he doesn't see the quiet walls building between us. At night, when the house above me quiets down, I sit in my chair with a cup of tea and read. I hear faint laughter from the living room, sometimes the clinking of glasses. There's a warmth up there, a life that I'm close enough to hear but not close enough to join. Sometimes I think about the day I moved in. Karen had shown me the basement with such enthusiasm, pointing out how cozy it was. She mentioned how Emily could visit any time, how I'd have privacy. I remember feeling grateful, relieved even. I told myself it was temporary, just until I found something else. But that something else never came. And now, years later, I realize I don't know if I was ever meant to leave the basement at all. Emily's question stayed with me long after she asked it. It wasn't just curiosity, it was the unspoken truth in her words. Even a child could see something was unusual. I brushed the thought aside that evening as I washed my teacup and turned out the light. But in the quiet darkness of the basement, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that her question had opened a door I wasn't ready to step through. David has always been the kind of man people describe as successful. At 40, he's the senior manager at a tech firm, the kind of job that keeps him constantly in motion. His life runs on schedules, meetings, and deadlines. He dresses sharply, speaks concisely, and measures everything in terms of efficiency. I am proud of him, of what he's achieved, but I sometimes wonder if he sees life as more than numbers and responsibilities. Karen, his wife, is 38 and just as polished. She's the sort of person who always has a plan, who runs the household like a well-organized machine. She manages the family finances, keeps Emily's school activities perfectly arranged, and ensures their social life is active. She is polite to me, always polite, but there's a distance in her voice, like a line that cannot be crossed. I remember when I first moved in. It was a bright spring afternoon and Karen greeted me at the door with a warm smile. David carried in my boxes, joking about how I'd finally let go of that old place. I told myself it was the right decision, selling my house, moving closer to family. Karen showed me the basement, pointing out the fresh paint, the new curtains, the small fridge they'd installed just for me. "It'll be perfect for you," she said, her voice cheerful. "You'll have your own space, and we'll all be right upstairs if you need anything." At the time, I didn't see anything wrong with it. I thanked them, grateful for their generosity. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice subtle patterns. One of the first red flags was the way family meals changed. When I first arrived, we had dinner together a few times a week, but gradually, those invitations became less frequent. Holidays, birthdays, or Sunday dinners. I'd hear the clink of dishes upstairs but wouldn't be called up. If I happened to come up on my own, Karen would smile and say, "Oh, we thought you'd be more comfortable eating downstairs. It's quieter for you there." It was never said unkindly, but it was always the same. Downstairs was better for me. I told myself it was nothing, that they were just trying to give me privacy. Karen, for her part, always kept interactions pleasant but brief. She would chat with me about Emily's school, ask if I needed anything from the store, and then move on. There were no long conversations, no lingering moments over tea. If I lingered too long in the kitchen, she'd glance at her watch or mention an upcoming task she needed to finish. Still, I didn't take offense. I thought maybe it was just her personality. Not everyone was as chatty as me, but there was one moment I couldn't quite forget. It was late one afternoon. I had gone upstairs to leave a folded basket of laundry in the living room when I heard Karen's voice from the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking in a hushed tone. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something urgent in her voice. I stepped toward the kitchen, about to let her know I was there, when she suddenly stopped talking. There was a pause, and then the faint sound of the call ending. Karen turned, phone in hand, her expression quickly smoothing into that polite smile. "Oh, hi, Margaret. I didn't hear you come up." Her voice was light, casual, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of surprise, maybe even unease. I brushed it off at the time, telling myself it was none of my business. But later that night, lying in bed, I thought about it again. It wasn't the phone call itself. It was the way she'd stopped so abruptly, the way her demeanor shifted instantly when she saw me. I didn't know what it meant, but it left a small seed of doubt in my mind. Over the months, I noticed more small things. Times when I'd hear laughter from upstairs, but no one would invite me. Times when I'd pass Karen in the hallway and she'd be texting quickly, her expression serious, before slipping the phone into her pocket. None of it was overt. None of it was rude. It was all careful. Too careful. Emily never noticed, of course. To her, everything was normal. But children don't see the undercurrents adults do. I told myself again and again that I was overthinking, that maybe Karen just valued her privacy, that maybe David was just too busy to notice. Still, every now and then, I'd remember that moment in the kitchen, the quick end to the call, the polite smile, and I'd feel that same small flicker of suspicion. I didn't know then that it was the first hint of something deeper. My 68th birthday started like any other day. I woke early, the basement still quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. The air was crisp, and I wrapped myself in a shawl before heading to the small counter to make tea. I had baked a cake the night before, a simple chocolate cake like the ones I used to make for David when he was little. It sat on the table now, perfectly frosted, ready to be shared. I told myself I wasn't expecting anything grand. A simple dinner together, maybe Emily's laughter filling the room, would have been more than enough. The morning passed slowly. I could hear movement upstairs. Karen's voice, David's footsteps, Emily's excited chatter. I smiled to myself, imagining them getting ready, maybe planning something special. By late morning, the house grew quieter. I didn't hear the usual kitchen noises, no clinking of pots or pans. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Perhaps they had gone out briefly to pick up something for later. I set the cake carefully on the counter and waited. Noon came and went. There was no knock at the basement door, no call for me to come upstairs. I checked the time again, nearly 1 o'clock. The basement felt colder than usual. I poured another cup of tea, trying to distract myself, but the silence was heavy. Finally, around 2, I decided to head upstairs. My steps felt slow, almost hesitant, as if I were intruding. When I reached the main floor, I looked around. The living room was empty. The dining table was bare, no plates or glasses set out. I walked into the kitchen. No sign of anyone. The air smelled faintly of perfume, not of cooking. My chest tightened slightly. I called out softly, "David, Karen, Emily?" No answer. A strange unease settled over me. I reached for my phone to call David, but before I could dial, a notification lit up the screen. Facebook. It was a post from Karen. I stared at the screen. A photo of David, Karen, and Emily smiling at a beautifully set table in a restaurant I recognized downtown. Emily was holding a cupcake with a single candle, her cheeks flushed from excitement. The caption read, "A beautiful family lunch, so grateful for these moments." For a moment, I just stared, the words blurring as my hands trembled. They were out celebrating, without me, on my birthday. I scrolled further. More photos. Emily showing off her cupcake, David laughing, Karen holding a glass of wine. My stomach twisted. Not a single mention of me, not even a hint of where I was supposed to be. I set the phone down on the counter, my fingers cold. I felt as though the air had been knocked out of me. My mind raced, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a work lunch that just happened to fall today. Maybe they planned something for later, but deep down, I knew better. I looked at the cake on the counter, the one I had carefully prepared. It sat there untouched, a silent reminder of what this day was supposed to be. I walked back to the basement slowly, each step heavier than the last. The hum of the heater seemed louder now, filling the silence. Sitting at the small table, I stared at the cake. I thought about all the birthdays I'd planned for David when he was young, the treasure hunts in the backyard, the surprise parties, the carefully chosen gifts. I thought about the years I spent making sure he felt loved, valued, celebrated. And now, here I was, alone, in the basement, on my own birthday. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was being silly, but the truth was, it hurt. It hurt in a way I couldn't put into words. I glanced at my phone again. No calls, no messages, just the fading glow of those photos in my mind. For the first time since I'd moved in, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was something heavier. A realization that I didn't quite belong here the way I had believed. Down in the basement, the walls felt closer. The silence felt sharper. I cut myself a small slice of cake and ate it quietly. It was sweet, but it felt hollow on my tongue. I thought about Emily, about how she might not even realize I wasn't there, about how one day she might grow up thinking this was normal, that grandmothers belong in basements, out of sight, out of mind. I set the fork down, my appetite gone. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Something isn't right here." I didn't know it yet, but that voice would grow louder in the days to come, and the truth it led me to would change everything. That evening, just as the shadows began to stretch across the basement walls, my phone buzzed. It was a text from David. "Mom, we thought you'd be more comfortable at home today. The restaurant was crowded, not the best place for you to relax. We'll celebrate another time." I stared at the words. Comfortable at home. It was phrased so neatly, so politely, as if being left alone on my birthday was somehow a favor. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply. What could I say? That I had spent the day in silence while they toasted without me? That I had sat beside a cake I baked myself, waiting for footsteps that never came? A heaviness settled in my chest, one that made it hard to breathe. I looked at the cake again, the single slice missing, the rest untouched. I thought about the countless birthdays I had organized for David, the sleepless nights, baking, decorating, making sure he felt celebrated. I had always been there, through every milestone, every achievement, and now, somehow, my presence had become optional. I moved to the small armchair in the corner of the basement. The heater clicked on, a dull hum filling the air. I wrapped my shawl around me and closed my eyes. But the ache in my chest wouldn't fade. From above, faint sounds drifted down. Voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. I could almost picture them. David, Karen, and Emily finishing dinner together, telling stories, sharing dessert. It wasn't just the noise that hurt. It was the reminder that life was happening just above my head, without me. At some point, I must have drifted into thought because I didn't notice the light footsteps on the basement stairs until I heard a soft knock at the door. "Grandma?" It was Emily's voice. I quickly sat up. "Come in, sweetheart." The door creaked open and Emily slipped inside, holding a small paper plate in her hands. On it was a single slice of cake, frosted cupcake crumbs scattered along the edges. "I brought you some dessert," she whispered. "Mommy said you might like it." I smiled, my heart aching at her thoughtfulness. "That's very sweet of you, Emily." She set the plate on the table, then sat on the edge of my bed, swinging her legs. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mommy says you like it down here. That's why you don't come upstairs a lot." Her words landed like a stone in my stomach. I tried to keep my expression neutral. "She said that, did she?" Emily nodded, looking perfectly innocent. "She says it's your special place, like a little house just for you." I forced a smile, though inside my mind was racing. Karen wasn't just leaving me out of things. She was shaping the way Emily saw me, normalizing my place in the basement as if it were my choice. "That's very thoughtful of Mommy," I said carefully, unwilling to put any doubt in Emily's mind. "But you know, I like visiting upstairs too." Emily grinned. "You should come up more. I like it when you're there." She hugged me before scampering back toward the stairs. The door closed softly behind her, and once again the basement was quiet. I sat there for a long while, staring at the untouched slice of cupcake. Emily's words echoed in my head. "Mommy says you like it down here." The more I thought about it, the more it felt intentional. Karen's careful politeness, her insistence that I'd be more comfortable apart from the family, it all began to look less like kindness and more like strategy. It wasn't just about space, it was about where I belonged in this house. That night, I lay in bed, the sounds from upstairs fading as the house went still. My mind replayed the day, the empty dining table, the text from David, Emily's quiet visit. Something was shifting inside me. A doubt I'd ignored before was now impossible to push away. For the first time, I began to wonder if my place in this family had been decided for me long before I ever stepped into this basement. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the narrow basement window. I woke earlier than usual, my mind still restless from the events of the day before. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the small table, the silence heavy. As I stirred the tea absent-mindedly, my eyes wandered to the storage boxes, stacked neatly in the corner. They held the remnants of my old life, photo albums, books, and important documents from the house I sold. I hadn't looked through them in months. On impulse, I decided to open one. Maybe I just wanted a distraction. I pulled out the top box, brushing away a thin layer of dust. Inside were familiar things: an old family photo of David as a boy, some holiday cards I'd saved, and at the very bottom, a manila folder labeled Property Documents. I froze for a moment. I remembered putting the papers there when I moved in, thinking I'd organize them later. I never had. I opened the folder slowly. The first few pages were familiar: the deed to my old house, the listing agreement, the sale contract. But as I flipped through, something caught my eye. The final page of the sale contract had a signature line. Mine was there, dated, clear as day. But right beneath it was another signature, David's. My brow furrowed. Why would David's name be on the contract? I flipped back to the details page. There it was, David listed not just as a witness, but as the account holder for the deposit of the sale proceeds. I sat back in my chair, my heartbeat quickening. That couldn't be right. When I sold the house, David had told me the funds would be held in a joint family account for safekeeping until I decided my next steps. I had assumed my name was on it too. I reached for my reading glasses and scanned the fine print again. There was no mention of my name on the account, only David's. A chill ran through me. I set the papers on the table and took a deep breath. I tried to remember the conversations from that time. David had been so reassuring. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll make sure everything's taken care of." Karen had been all smiles, promising they'd help me manage things. I'd trusted them completely. And now, here it was in black and white. David was the sole beneficiary of the sale funds. I stood pacing the small room. My thoughts raced. Where was that money now? What had been done with it? I went back to the folder, searching for any mention of a secondary account. Nothing. The paperwork was clean, neatly prepared and very deliberate. A knot formed in my stomach. I sat again, the weight of realization pressing on me. Without that money, I had nothing of my own. My savings were minimal. My only income was my modest pension. I thought back to Karen's polite insistence that I stay in the basement, David's rare comments about how it's easier this way. Slowly, a picture began to form, one I didn't want to see. I picked up the contract again, running my finger along David's signature. I had trusted my son completely. Now, for the first time, I wondered if that trust had been misplaced. I placed the documents back in the folder, my mind swirling. For years, I had told myself I was here out of convenience, that staying in the basement was just temporary. But now, looking at the reality, I began to see the truth. I wasn't just a guest, I was dependent. Completely. The realization made my chest tighten. I closed the folder carefully and tucked it back into the box, my hands shaking slightly. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the boxes. It felt as if the walls of the basement were closing in just a little more. Emily's voice from the night before echoed in my mind. "Mommy says you like it down here." It wasn't just about comfort, it was about control. I sat back at the table, the tea now cold. I stared at my reflection in the dark liquid, trying to decide what to do next. For now, I would say nothing. But I knew one thing for certain. This basement was no longer just a quiet place. It was a cage, and I had just found the first key to understanding why. The contract I found in the box would not leave my mind. It sat in the back of my thoughts like a weight, heavy and constant. The basement felt smaller now, the air tighter. I needed to know more. The next morning, after the family left for work and school, I decided to dig deeper. I pulled my old laptop from the closet and connected it to the Wi-Fi. It had been months since I'd used it, but my online banking login was still saved. I opened my account. The numbers staring back at me were sobering, just my small pension deposits and routine withdrawals for personal expenses. No sign of the funds from the house sale. I clicked through the statements from 2 years ago, the month the house sold. There it was. A single transfer, the proceeds moved entirely into a joint account in David's name. But what stopped me cold was the second name on the account, Karen. I stared at the screen. David had told me the account was for safekeeping, yet somehow Karen had access to it as well. A prickle of unease ran through me. Why would she need access to my money? I dug deeper, clicking through months of transaction history. At first, the withdrawals looked ordinary. Mortgage payments, school tuition for Emily, groceries. But then something unusual caught my eye. Several large transfers to an account name I didn't recognize. I copied the transaction details and searched the name online. It led me to a limited liability company registered just last year. The owner? Karen Miller, my daughter-in-law. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. Karen had used my house money to fund some sort of business. I searched the company further. It wasn't anything I had heard them talk about. It wasn't related to David's work or Emily's school or any family necessity. From what I could piece together, it was a real estate investment. Properties purchased, renovated, and rented out. The more I read, the colder I felt. This wasn't a side project. This was deliberate. A carefully hidden investment completely separate from the family's daily life. I sat in silence. The hum of the laptop fanned the only sound. My thoughts raced. All this time, I had believed I was staying in the basement for convenience, for privacy. But now, I saw it differently. My presence downstairs wasn't about my comfort. It was about control. Karen didn't just want me out of sight. She wanted my resources. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands were trembling, but not from fear this time. I thought back to every polite smile, every carefully phrased assurance. "It's better for you down here, Margaret. You'll be more comfortable." Now those words rang hollow. It wasn't just David making decisions. Karen had a direct hand in shaping my life in this house. And she had reasons, financial ones, that went far beyond family harmony. For a long time, I sat in the quiet basement, my mind moving from hurt to clarity. The betrayal cut deep, but alongside it grew something else, determination. I realized I couldn't confront them yet, not without proof. The contract and the bank records were a start, but I needed more. I needed to understand exactly what Karen was doing with my money. I reached for my phone and began making a list of the documents I needed. Full bank statements, property records linked to Karen's company, any correspondence that might connect the dots. I didn't know how far this went, but I was certain of one thing. This wasn't about me liking the basement. This was about someone ensuring I stayed right where they wanted me, quiet, out of sight, and powerless. That thought alone shifted something inside me. I wasn't just a passive guest anymore. I put the folder back in its place, locked my laptop, and stood. The basement still felt small, but now it also felt like the place where I would start my fight. A few days later, I was in the basement folding laundry when I heard the sound of little footsteps on the stairs. Emily burst through the door, holding one of her school drawings in her hands. "Grandma, look what I made," she said, running over to me. I set the laundry aside and admired her picture. Bright colors, a house with a big tree in the front, a family standing outside. "It's beautiful," I said, smiling. "Who's that in the picture?" "That's Mommy, Daddy, me, and you," she said proudly, pointing at each figure. I laughed softly, touched. "I love it, sweetheart." She looked around the basement for a moment, her little brow furrowing. "Grandma, why don't you put your pictures upstairs? There's so much more room on the walls up there." I hesitated. "Well, I guess. I just keep my things down here." Emily nodded seriously, then leaned closer and said in a conspiratorial whisper, "Mommy says you shouldn't be upstairs when guests are here, because they might ask questions." The words hit me like a cold wind. "What kind of questions, Emily?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Emily shrugged. "I don't know. Mommy just says it's better for everyone if you stay here. That way no one feels weird." I felt a chill run through me. I forced a smile, not wanting Emily to see my reaction. "That's very thoughtful of Mommy," I said gently. She beamed and hugged me before running back toward the stairs. "I'll come back after homework," she called out. When the door closed, I sat back in my chair, my mind spinning. Guests asking questions. It wasn't about my comfort at all. It was about control of the story. I thought back to the day I moved in, how Karen had so eagerly shown me the basement, the polite boundaries, the sudden avoidance of shared meals. It all began to connect. I looked around the basement, my eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. This wasn't just a space for me. It was a place to keep me contained, separate. Then my gaze drifted to a locked cabinet tucked in the corner, one I hadn't paid much attention to before. It had been here since I moved in, Karen claiming it was just storage for old paperwork. On impulse, I pulled out the drawer of a nearby desk, searching for the small ring of keys Karen had given me for my use. To my surprise, one of them fit. The cabinet door creaked open. Inside were stacks of files, neatly organized in labeled folders. Most were ordinary, utilities, tax forms, but one caught my eye: property reassignment. My pulse quickened as I pulled it out. The folder contained legal documents related to the house we were living in now. My eyes scanned the pages, and there it was, my name. I had been listed as a partial owner on an earlier deed, something David had mentioned briefly when I helped with the down payment years ago. But the later pages told a different story. My name had been removed in a reassignment file just before I moved in. The signature line for the reassignment was dated within the same week my old house was sold. I sat down heavily. Karen hadn't just been managing money, she'd been managing ownership, making sure that legally I no longer had any claim to the home I was living in. And now Emily's words made perfect sense. If guests found out I was living in the basement, if they asked questions about why, Karen would have to explain why the former part owner of the home was now tucked out of sight. I flipped through the rest of the folder, my fingers trembling. At the very back was a document without a final signature. It was another property transfer, this one concerning a small rental property under Karen's LLC, the same company I had discovered in the bank statements. But the paper wasn't complete. There were sections left blank, notes scribbled in the margins. It looked like a draft, maybe even an unfiled copy. I stared at it, the pieces falling into place. Karen had built an entire network of control. My money, my ownership rights, even my place in the house. And she had done it so neatly, so politely that I hadn't seen it until now. I slid the folder back into the cabinet, locking it carefully. Standing in the quiet basement, I felt my chest rise and fall with a new kind of energy. The sadness and confusion I'd carried for weeks shifted into something sharper. Focus. I now had more than suspicions. I had proof. Proof that I wasn't just imagining things. Proof that my life here had been carefully orchestrated to keep me dependent and silent. I glanced toward the stairs. I could hear faint movement upstairs. Karen's voice, light and cheerful, probably on the phone again. She had no idea what I had just found, and that, I thought, gave me the advantage. After finding the reassignment papers in the locked cabinet, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. My instincts screamed at me to confront Karen immediately, to hold the documents up in her face and demand answers. But a voice deep down told me that rushing into this would only give her the upper hand. I needed to be careful, precise. The next morning, after the house emptied out, I sat at the basement table with the folder open in front of me. My eyes lingered on the unfiled property transfer document and the reassignment removing my name from the deed. They were more than suspicious. They were leverage. I thought of someone who could help me. Martin Caldwell. Martin had been a friend of my late husband. He'd practiced law for decades before retiring, mostly in property and estate cases. We'd lost touch over the years, but I still had his number written in my old address book. I hesitated before dialing. It felt strange to call after so long, but the moment his familiar voice answered, I felt a rush of relief. "Margaret, it's been years," he said warmly. "I know, Martin," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need your advice. It's about some property documents. I think something's not right." We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the edge of town later that day. I tucked the documents carefully into my bag, making sure Karen wouldn't notice I was leaving. When I arrived, Martin greeted me with the same kind eyes I remembered. I laid the papers out on the table, explaining everything, selling my old house, moving into the basement, the reassignment I'd just discovered. Martin read through each page carefully, occasionally pausing to make notes. When he looked up, his expression had shifted to one of quiet seriousness. "Margaret, this reassignment, it's not airtight. If you can prove you signed it under misleading circumstances or without full understanding, it could be challenged, especially considering the timing with the sale of your previous home." I exhaled slowly. "So, it's not hopeless?" He shook his head. "Far from it. But you need to be smart. If they suspect you're preparing to fight, they could move assets or cover their tracks. You need to collect everything, bank statements, communications, any proof that the arrangement wasn't as they described." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "And then?" "Then," he said, leaning in slightly, "you choose your moment. A confrontation isn't just about what you say. It's about when and how you say it." I left the cafe feeling strangely calm. For the first time, I had more than suspicion. I had a plan. Back at the house, I decided to take Martin's advice. I would stay quiet, act as though nothing had changed. Over the next week, I moved carefully, deliberately. When Karen came down to the basement to ask if I needed anything, I smiled and thanked her. I cooked a few dinners and left them upstairs as a gesture, keeping my tone warm and unthreatening. But when I was alone, I worked. I began gathering everything. The sale contract from my old house, the reassignment removing my name from the current deed, bank statements showing the transfer of my sale, proceeds to David and Karen's joint account, the transaction records linking Karen's LLC to my funds, the unfiled property transfer for Karen's investment property. I organized them into a neat folder, labeling each section. Then I waited for the perfect opportunity. It came sooner than I expected. Karen mentioned one afternoon that they were planning a family dinner the following week. "Just us," she said with a smile. "It's been too long since we all sat together." Her voice was light, but I sensed a touch of calculation. I decided that would be the night. In the days leading up to the dinner, I rehearsed in my mind. I pictured the table, Emily's innocent face, David's distracted demeanor, Karen's controlled smile. I imagined the moment I would lay the documents on the table, the silence that would follow. I would not raise my voice. I would not lose my composure. Karen believed I was quiet and compliant. David believed I would never challenge him, and that, I thought, would make the truth hit harder when it finally came out. As the evening approached, I placed the folder of evidence into my handbag, sliding it between a book and my knitting bag to keep it hidden. In the quiet of the basement that night, I sat alone, listening to the faint hum of the heater. I felt the tension building, but beneath it all was something stronger: resolve. They had kept me in the basement to keep me small, invisible. But soon, at that dinner table, they would see just how visible I could be. The night of the dinner arrived with the smell of roasted chicken drifting faintly down to the basement. I could hear Karen moving around in the kitchen, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Emily's voice chimed now and then, light and sweet, while David's deeper tone floated in between. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my sweater. The folder was tucked neatly inside my handbag, the weight of it both grounding and electric. When I came upstairs, the dining room was set beautifully. Candles flickered gently, casting a warm glow over the table. Karen greeted me with her usual polite smile. "There you are, Margaret. We're so glad you could join us tonight." "Of course," I said, my voice calm. David pulled out a chair for me, his phone still in his hand. Emily ran over to hug me tightly. "Grandma, you made it," she said, as if my attendance were unusual. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Conversation drifted easily between Emily's school projects and David's work deadlines. Karen filled plates with practiced efficiency, pouring wine for David and herself. I waited, biding my time. About halfway through the meal, I set my fork down gently and smiled at Emily. "Do you remember the old house I used to have, sweetheart? The one with the big maple tree in the yard?" Emily's eyes lit up. "The one in the photo album? Yes." Karen glanced up briefly, her expression tightening just enough for me to notice. "Yes," I continued, my voice warm. "I sold that house a few years ago before I moved here. Do you know what we did with the money from that sale?" Karen's hand paused briefly over her wine glass. David looked up, mildly puzzled. "Mom, why are we talking about this now?" I smiled at him. "Oh, just reminiscing. I was thinking about how I trusted you both to keep it safe for me." Karen's eyes flickered, her smile returning quickly. "Of course, Margaret. We've always made sure you were taken care of." I reached into my handbag and pulled out the first document, the sale contract. I laid it gently on the table, turning it so David and Karen could see. "I found this in my old papers. I noticed something interesting. The deposit went into a joint account. Yours and Karen's names." David frowned slightly, leaning forward. "Yes, Mom. We discussed that. It was for convenience." "Convenience," I repeated softly. I reached for the next set of papers. And yet, I also found bank statements showing large transfers from that account to another. An LLC, Karen's company. Karen's hand froze on her wine glass. I watched her carefully. That was surprising to me, because I had no idea my money was being invested. And then I found property records, a condo purchased under that LLC, a condo in Karen's name alone. David turned sharply to Karen. "A condo? What condo?" Karen's lips parted, but no words came out immediately. The room seemed to still, the faint clink of Emily's fork on her plate the only sound. I continued, my tone even but pointed. "It's fascinating, isn't it? To think that the proceeds from my house could be turned into an asset, one I was never told about, one that even you, David, didn't seem to know existed." David's expression darkened as he turned fully toward his wife. "Karen, what is she talking about?" Karen's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment. "It was an investment," she said quickly, "for the family. I didn't think we needed to discuss every detail." David's voice was sharper now. "Every detail? You bought a property without telling me, with my mother's money?" I stayed silent for a moment, letting the tension rise, the silence pull taut across the table. Emily looked between her parents, confusion clear in her young face. Karen's gaze darted back to me, her lips tightening. Margaret, I never intended. I raised a hand slightly. I'm not here for apologies, Karen. I'm here for clarity, for Emily's sake, for David's sake, and for mine. David sat back, rubbing his forehead. The realization of betrayal was settling on him like a heavy stone. Karen's eyes flashed, at me, at him, at the situation unraveling faster than she could control. I folded my hands on the table. I thought it was important that we all understand the truth. Tonight seemed like the right night. The room was silent for a long moment. Then David spoke, his voice low. Karen, we're going to talk about this later. His tone made clear it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. Karen looked at me, her polite facade gone. For the first time, there was a flicker of something raw. Anger, maybe even fear. I met her gaze evenly. I've kept quiet for a long time, but not anymore. David stared at Karen as though seeing her for the first time. His voice was low, dangerous. You bought a condo in your name, with my mother's money, and you didn't think I needed to know? Karen's eyes flickered, her carefully built composure threatening to crack. David, it's not what you think. David cut her off, his voice rising. Not what I think? What else could it possibly be? Emily's fork clattered onto her plate. Her small voice trembled. Mommy, why did you lie to me about Grandma? You said she liked being in the basement. The room went still. Karen's face paled slightly. David turned toward Emily, his expression softening, but before he could speak, Karen jumped in. Emily, sweetheart, I never lied. Yes, you did. Emily's voice wavered, her eyes filling with tears. You said Grandma liked it down there so she wouldn't be in the way. But Grandma doesn't like it, does she? Emily looked at me, her big eyes glistening. I reached over and took her hand gently. Sweetheart, I've been fine, but sometimes adults make choices that aren't fair, and it's okay to ask questions about them. David turned back to Karen, his voice cold now. So this is what you've been doing? Keeping my mother out of sight while you moved her money around? While you bought yourself a condo? Karen's tone sharpened. Don't make this sound like some betrayal, David. Everything I've done has been for this family. The investments, the decisions. Investments you didn't tell me about, he shot back. The tension at the table built like a storm. Karen's voice rose, defensive and clipped. You're always too busy to deal with these things. Someone has to make decisions. And you decided the best way was to hide them from me? From my mother? Karen's lips tightened. Margaret has been perfectly comfortable. She's had her space, her privacy. I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. Privacy is not the same as isolation, Karen. Comfort is not the same as being excluded. And space is not the same as being stripped of one's rights. Karen's eyes snapped toward me, her mouth opening, but I raised my hand slightly. No, Karen. I've stayed quiet for a long time. I let you and David make decisions because I trusted you. That trust is gone. David looked at me, guilt clear in his face. Mom, I should have paid closer attention. I didn't know. I shook my head. It's not just about knowing, David. It's about choosing to see. I've been here for years, and the signs were all around us. Emily looked between us, tears on her cheeks. Grandma, are you going to leave? I squeezed her hand. No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere. But I'm not going to be in the basement anymore either. Karen scoffed lightly, but there was an edge of unease in her voice. And where exactly do you think you're going to go, Margaret? I met her gaze directly. Upstairs, into the home I helped pay for, and into the life I was pushed out of. I will not be treated as a guest in a place that was built with my sacrifices. Karen's jaw tightened. David remained silent, his eyes shifting between us. I reached into my bag and placed the folder of documents on the table. These are copies of everything. The sale of my house, the reassignment of the deed, the bank transfers, the condo purchase. I have legal counsel who will be very interested in this. Karen's face drained of color. You wouldn't. I leaned in slightly. You've spent years believing I wouldn't. That's why we are here now. David exhaled sharply, pushing his chair back. This conversation is over for tonight. We'll talk about it tomorrow. I shook my head. No, David, the conversation is over because I am done being the quiet one. Things will change starting now. The room was silent except for Emily's soft sniffles. Karen's hands were clenched in her lap, her eyes averted. David looked like a man standing in the wreckage of something he'd thought was stable. I stood, my voice steady. I will be moving my things upstairs tomorrow. This basement has been my cage long enough. And as for the financial side, we'll address that through the proper channels. No one stopped me as I gathered my handbag. Emily rushed to hug me, holding on tightly. I'm glad you're not leaving, Grandma, she whispered. I kissed her hair gently. I'm not going anywhere, Emily. I'm just finally going where I belong. A few months passed, and the rhythm of the house had shifted in ways I could not have imagined back when I was sitting alone in the basement. I now lived upstairs, in a sunny bedroom that overlooked the backyard. The room had once been a guest space, but David had insisted on renovating it for me. The walls were painted a soft cream, and the windowsills were lined with small pots of herbs Emily and I had planted together. The change wasn't just in the room, it was in the way I was treated. David, to his credit, had made an effort. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the air between us felt taut, but there was a new kind of respect in his tone. He checked in with me more often, asked my opinion on household decisions, and even took time to have coffee with me on weekends. I could see he was trying to make up for what had happened, even if neither of us spoke about it directly. The guilt lingered in his eyes sometimes, but I didn't press. Some truths took time to settle. Karen, on the other hand, was no longer living in the house. After the dinner confrontation, she had left to give everyone space, as she put it. David told me she was staying with a friend while they worked things out. I didn't ask for details, but I knew the tension between them wasn't something that could be neatly resolved. Her absence brought an unexpected calm to the house. The sharp edges of daily life seemed to soften. Meals became more relaxed. Laughter, real, unguarded laughter, began to echo in the rooms again, mostly thanks to Emily. Emily had grown more attached to me in these months. She spent hours in my room doing homework at the small desk or reading beside me. She'd often bring her blanket and curl up in the armchair while I knitted. One evening, as we watered the herbs on my windowsill, she looked up at me and asked, "Grandma, are you happier now?" I smiled softly. "Yes, Emily, I'm much happier." She nodded seriously. "I like that you're upstairs. It feels more like you're part of everything." Her words warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. She was right. Being upstairs wasn't just about space. It was about belonging. David noticed the bond between Emily and me, and though I caught hints of sadness in his expression sometimes, I also saw gratitude. He seemed relieved that Emily had someone stable, someone who could remind her of the values he was still learning to prioritize. Honesty, openness, family. Karen's absence had left a gap, but it also created an opportunity. David began handling things himself. School drop-offs, dinners, household budgets. He even asked me for advice about managing certain expenses. It wasn't lost on me that these were tasks Karen had guarded closely before. The house was quieter without her constant energy, but it was also steadier. And in that steadiness, David and I began to find a rhythm. Sometimes we'd sit in the kitchen after Emily had gone to bed, sharing a pot of tea. The conversations were tentative at first, about the weather, about work, but gradually we began to talk about the past. He didn't offer full apologies, but in his own way, he acknowledged his mistakes. "I should have paid more attention," he said one evening, his voice low. I didn't realize how far things had gone. I looked at him for a long moment. Sometimes it's easier not to see what's uncomfortable. He nodded, not defensive, just thoughtful. I'm trying to do better. And he was. Life in the house wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments when I felt the shadow of the basement, when old habits urged me to keep quiet or step aside. But each day I reminded myself that I had earned my place here, not as a guest, but as family. Emily, in her innocent way, reinforced that lesson daily. She would tug at my hand, pulling me into the living room to watch her draw or ask me to help her with school projects. One Saturday morning, she sat at the kitchen table working on an essay. "Grandma," she said without looking up, "we're writing about someone we admire. I'm writing about you." My heart tightened. "Why me, sweetheart?" She looked up, her expression earnest. "Because you tell the truth, even when it's hard, and because you didn't let anyone keep you in the basement." I felt a lump rise in my throat. David, who had been pouring coffee, glanced over. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and in that look there was an unspoken understanding. He knew Emily had learned something important from all of this. As the months rolled on, the house felt different. Not perfect, but healthier. Boundaries were clearer, respect was mutual, and in the quiet moments, I realized that I had not just reclaimed my place in the home, but also in my own life. The seasons changed, and with them, so did I. Looking back now, I can hardly recognize the woman who first came to live in the basement. I remember her, quiet, grateful to have a place, willing to make herself small to avoid being a burden. But that version of me feels like someone I once knew, not someone I am now. In these months, I've learned that being quiet isn't the same as being weak, and that patience doesn't mean accepting injustice. I have a voice, and I have a place, both in this house and in my life. Emily has been my greatest reminder of that truth. One warm spring afternoon, we were sitting in the garden together. She was kneeling beside me, her small hands pressing a marigold into the soil. The sun lit her hair, and she looked so much like her father when he was her age that it caught my breath for a moment. "Grandma," she said suddenly without looking up, "I'm glad you live upstairs now." I smiled softly. "I'm glad too, Emily." She glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "Will you ever have to go back to the basement?" I shook my head. "No, sweetheart, I'll never go back. And neither should you, figuratively speaking." She tilted her head. "What does that mean?" I brushed a bit of soil from my hands. "It means, don't ever let anyone decide where you belong. Not in this house, not in life. You choose that for yourself. Always." She nodded seriously, the kind of understanding that only children can have. Simple, but deep. It was a promise I intended to keep for her in more ways than one. Because in the months since Karen had left, I had been busy. Quietly, carefully, I had worked with Martin, the retired lawyer, to review all the property documents connected to Karen's LLC. The condo Karen had purchased in her name with my funds was a critical piece. Through legal channels, we established that the investment had been made with my assets, without full consent or disclosure. Negotiations were tense, but in the end, the ownership transferred to me as part of a settlement. David didn't contest it. Whether out of guilt, pragmatism, or both, he stepped aside. I didn't keep the condo for myself. Instead, I rented it out. The income went into a separate account, one I quietly designated as a college fund for Emily. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that the next generation had more choices, more security than I had. Emily didn't know, of course. One day she would. And I hoped that when she did, she'd see it as proof that standing up for yourself can also mean protecting those you love. Karen had not returned to the house. There were murmurs of her considering selling her other investments, of moving on entirely. I didn't ask questions. Her chapter in this house seemed to be closing quietly, just as she had tried to keep mine quiet for years. David and I continued to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't without its complexities, but there was progress. He respected my space, my decisions, and in his own way, he seemed proud of my determination. Sometimes I caught him watching Emily and me in the garden, a thoughtful expression on his face. I wondered if he saw not just his mother and daughter, but also the lessons unfolding between us. On that particular afternoon, Emily patted the soil around the marigold and looked up at me. "Grandma, when the flowers grow, will they stay forever?" I smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Flowers don't last forever, Emily. But the seeds they leave behind can grow again and again. That's what matters." She seemed satisfied with that answer, returning to her work with renewed focus. I looked at her, at the rows of young plants we had tended together, and felt a sense of peace. The basement felt like a lifetime ago. I was no longer the invisible guest, the quiet presence tucked away. I was Margaret Thompson, mother, grandmother, homeowner, and woman who had learned to claim her own space. And as I watched Emily press another seed into the earth, I realized something else. This wasn't just my victory. It was hers too, and one day she'd understand just how much. The sun was warm on my shoulders, the air fragrant with the promise of new blooms. Beside me, Emily hummed softly as she worked, her small hands firm and sure in the soil. It was the perfect ending, not because everything was perfect, but because we had grown something better from the ground we were given.